Okay, I don't know how to do that.
Afterwards, I'll tell you.
Oh, see, here you go. Every
See, we're
tzaddik
already
that
having a
comes
good
on in the
conversation.
morning, every tzaddik that comes on in the morning costs me another 100 megabytes so that I could see his face.
So we can fix that.
Okay.
Oh, 1 second.
I see. Usually it's the other way around. If you want a private share, you have to pay. It sounds like it's costing you more the more we come.
Yeah, I told you, Yosy Simon, the Rebbe is becoming too good.
I believe you. Don't worry. That's the problem. Okay, today is the yahrzeit of the Atzei Chaim, who was in the Satmar dynasty. He was the son of the Kedushas Yom Tov, I believe. And there's
my namesake.
Oh, really? Chaim Tzvi, that's right. Atzei Chaim was Chaim Tzvi's Halberstam. That's right. So the Atzei Chaim, when he got smicha, the Rebbe's Gabba, his father's Gabba, whose name was Osher, I remember his last name, took him to Lemberg, and the Rav of Lemberg gave him smicha. So the Rav heard him, and he wrote up a nice smicha. After the Rav dismissed him from his office, he went outside, and he sees a guy sitting there. So he says, "Can I help you? Why don't you come in? It's your turn." The Rav of Lemberg, Weislich, wasn't Chassidish. He didn't have a Gabba. He was the usher on his own. So the fellow said, "No, I'm just here. I'm just the Gabba." So he says, "Who is this?" He says, "This is the Atzei Chaim." Well, he wasn't Atzei Chaim then. This is the son of the Kedushas Yom Tov. He's a Satmar Einikel, and I'm the Rebbe's Gabba, so I brought him. So he tells the Atzei Chaim, "Come back in. I want to write you up a smicha that's pasandik for a Satmar Einikel." So the Atzei Chaim answered back to the Rav from Lemberg. He said, "I came to get smicha for me, not for my father. So whatever I deserve on my own is what I'll take." So it's chusayach naleinu.
1 second. The Hungarians went to the publishers for a smicha?
When it came to Torah, they needed to find it where it was available.
Yeah. That's unbelievable.
And then, see, everyone got along in those days.
Yeah.
And then, now I'm not saying that's the only smicha he got.
That's hard to believe also.
No, he wanted like an international driver's license, so he had to get a smicha at international recognized suppliers. The other story is the Skolyer Rebbe Zatzal. It's his yahrzeit as well. He had a shtibel in Williamsburg in the Borough Park on 48th Street, and he was a Balmanagin. He was a real orator. And what he used to do is, by Tish, they would be mechabed any guest to read any pasuk that they wanted from the parsha, and the Skolyer Rebbe would darshan for 2 hours on that pasuk. So once the Skolyer Rebbe found himself in Ireland for Shabbos, and the Rav of Ireland said, "Rebbe, it's very, very chashuv. You could darshan for 2 hours. What's the big deal? Tell us the truth. Tell us that you plant the guest, and tell him which pasuk to say. It's not like we're going to look any less of you because of it. Even what you do, knowing the pasuk in advance, is quite impressive." So the Rebbe told the Rav, "Okay, you tell me which pasuk to darshan on." And the Rav said, "Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda." I'm not sure what parsha it's in, but it's one of the parshas that we just learned now. And he darshaned till 2:30 in the morning. He wouldn't stop until the Rav said, "Rebbe, achbat mechila, okay," and he finally stopped. So the Rebbe said, "No problem, but you should never call a yid a shakran again." Okay, so the Gemara. So we were discussing yesterday, like we just reviewed, the order of operations of how korbanos are brought. But of course, there were other korbanos as well that were brought that we didn't fill them into the context of the backdrop of the Talmud and the Korban Pesach. So the Gemara here is going to deal with some more korbanos. So the last thing we learned was that the first korban of the day is supposed to be the korban Talmud shel Shachris. The last korban of the day is supposed to be the korban Talmud shel Bein Harabayim. And the only exception that we're aware of right now is the korban Pesach. We're soon going to see that there are other exceptions as well. Tana Rabban, Talmud kodim lePesach. The korban Talmud shel Bein Harabayim is brought before the Korban Pesach. Pesach kodim lektoris. So now we know that you're makriv the lektoris after the Korban Pesach, which surely is after the Talmud Shel Bein Harbayim. And Ketoris Kodemus L'Neiris. It seems like the Neiris was the absolutely last thing that was done in the Beis HaMikdash at the end of the day. Why is it that order? Zok to Gemara, Ye'uchar, we should delay Dovar Shenemer Boy, the Neiris, where it says, regarding the Neiris, it says the word Ba'erev, and it says Bein Harabayim. That should be later than L'Dovar Shaloi Nemer Boy Ba'erev Ela Bein Harabayim Bilvad. By Pesach, it only says Bein Harabayim. By the Neiris, it says Ba'erev and Bein Harabayim. And Ba'erev means late in the afternoon. Make it later. So there's a double lashon of later by Menorah. There's only a single lashon of later by Pesach. And therefore, it's becoming that the Menorah should be later. So let's see the three psukim, Aleph, Beis, and Gimel. So, Ki im alamokim asher yivchar Hashem alekecha l'shaket shmei sham tizbach es ha-pesach ba'erev kavoi ha-shemesh moitzesim mitzrayim. And then it says, so I was wrong. We're not talking about the relationship between Pesach and Menorah. We're talking about the relationship of Tamid and Pesach. So by Pesach, it says Ba'erev, and it says Bein Harbayim. And by the Korban Tamid, it says, there's a keves echad tasav al boker, there's a keves asheni tasav Bein Harbayim. So since there's only one lashon of Bein Harbayim by the Talmud, there's two lashonis of Bein Harabayim by the Pesach. So the Pesach were makriv after we're makriv the Korban Talmud Shel Bein Harabayim. Fact the Gemara, ihachi ketoris v'neiris nami nikdemu Pesach. Based on what you're saying, that since Pesach has a double lashon of Bein Harabayim, ketoris and neiris should be before the Korban Pesach and not after. Why? For the same reason. Ye'uchar dover shenemer boy ba'erev Bein Harabayim. The Pesach, which has both Ba'erev and Bein Harabayim, should be later than the Menorah and the Ketoris, where it only says Ba'erev once. So we have to keep this kasha in mind, because this kasha is suggesting that the Korban Pesach should be brought after the Ketoris Veneris. The reason why we have to keep this kasha in mind is because we're soon going to quote a shita that actually says this. Zok to Gemara, Shiny Hassam, the reason why Ketoris and Neiris are still after the Korban Pesach is the Miyat Rachmanah. There's a special Miyat by Menorah where it says Oisai. So let's see the pasuk of Oisai. The pasuk says, "Ba'oil moed michutz taparoches asher la edus yarich Oisai," referring to the Neiris. Yarich Oisai Aaron Uvanov may erev ad boiker, which the Gemara is going to darshan here. Lefnei Hashem. So Zok to Gemara, Omar Kra Yaroich Oisoi Aaron Ivanov. I'm sorry, I skipped. Shiny husband Dmitry Achmana Oisoi, the Tanya, may Erev Viad Boiker. It says in the pasuk that the lights, the Neiris should burn may Erev Ad Boiker. Tein la midasa should Heidoy Lekes may Erev Ad Boiker. Put in a half a loig of oil into each cup, so that they should burn all night, even on a long night, such as the winter nights, which are longer. In the summer nights, there's going to be too much oil. So what they used to do is, they always put in the same amount of oil. What changed was the thickness of the wick. The longer the night was, the thinner they made the wick. So the flame would be a little bit smaller. It would last longer. In the summer, they put in a much thicker wick. They burnt a much larger flame, and therefore the larger amount of oil still was consumed throughout the night. Dover acher, another pshat, ein loch avoida shekshera me'erev ad boiker el zubavad. The only avoida that's supposed to be at night, meaning the last avoida of the day, when nothing else happens, and this runs through the night, it's only menorah. My timer. What's the reason? Amar kra yaroich oisoi aroy nuvonov me'erev ad boiker. We darshan oisoi me'erev ad boiker, ve'ein dover acher me'erev ad boiker. There's nothing else that should be overnight. Meaning the last thing that's done that stays overnight is the menorah. The iskish ketoris l'neris. So we've explained very nicely why neris is the last. but Dr. Gemara, there's a hekesh of Keteris to Neiros, and we learn man Neiros ein avoida ksher achareh, af Keteris ein avoida ksher achareh. It's the very, very last thing. Keteris and Neiros travel together. Okay, very good. So we know Keteris and Neiros travel together, but how do we know that Keteris is before the Neiros? Maybe Neiros should be before the Keteris. So the Pashut shot you could say is the makar of the halacha that the Neiros is last and the Keteris is last is from Neiros. Keteris you only learn is from Neiros. So Neiros is last, and Keteris is second last. But there are those who say a beautiful pshat. Keteris is made to be mechaper on the aver of Lashon Hara. It's brought down. And it says that Yovei Keteris that's brought b'chashoy, it's brought privately to the Heichal, nobody's there when it's brought, and it should be mechaper on Dibur that people say quietly, privately, backstabbing Lashon Hara. Neiros represents Torah, which also represents our lips, because we learn Torah with our mouths. We discuss Torah, which was a learning. So the svara is it's appropriate that first we should purify our mouths, we should purify our lips with the Keteris, and then we should engage in speech of Kedusha and speech of Torah, which is represented by the Neiros. V'tanya Kikusha. We also had a brisa that actually follows the logic of the kasha we had, which is that the Korban Pesach should be brought after the Keteris and after the Neiros. Because it says in the brisa, Tomid Kodem L'Keteris, Koderis Kodemis L'Neiros, V'Neiros Kodemis L'Pesach. So you see here, that svara, that Pesach is the last. Because of this svara that we said earlier. Yu'uchar davar shenemar boy be'erev, ubein harbayim, the Korban Pesach, which has a nusach of sai ba'erev and sai bein harbayim, l'davar shaloi nemar boy ela bein harbayim b'lvat. To the Talmud, where it only says bein harbayim. By Neiros, it only says bein harbayim. Frek the Gemara. These words have to be changed. These words have to be changed. I forgot exactly the nusach, but the hok siv is taken out. The Gemara asks me, "What do you do with what do you do with the diak of oisai?" Not because it's extra, but it does say oisai. So Zaktumar Hai oisai miboile lamute avoida shebepnim. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm making a mistake with a Gemara later. This nusach is perfect the way it is. I apologize. V'aksiv oisai, it does say oisai, which would indicate the Neiros are the last, like we said earlier. So the more high oisai mi boile, that the oisai that by Menorah we used to teach us something else. Lamute avoid shebepnim, umay niu Keteris. It's to teach us. So Rashahu oisai lav lamute Pesach also. That's not to tell us that the Neiros are last after the Pesach. He avoidus chutz, because Pesach is avoidus chutz. The mistaver the chi kamamit avoidus pnim the kavasa kamamit. It's mistaber to say that when it says oisoi, it's not coming to be b'mayit Pesach, that Pesach is going to be before it. Rather, it's going to be b'mayit and avoidus shebefnim and avoidus that in the heichal. Neiros avoidus pnim, ukteris avoidus pnim. So the oisoi is telling you that you do the Neiros after you do the Keteris. Umayni Keteris. So kedaita chamina. I might have thought hoiluch siv ubahalis arnis haneris bein harbayim yaktirena. So the lashon pasuk is bein harbayim yaktirena. Yaktirena sounds like Keteris. So ema nadlik neris beresha. First light the neris of the noyer. V'hader naktir Keteris. And maybe that's what's marum is in the bein harbayim yaktirena. That after you do the neris, then do the Keteris. Mit rechmana oisoi. That's why the Torah by Neiros sticks in the word oisoi to tell us that the last thing is the Neiros and not the Keteris. The Keteris is before the Neiros. And here is where the words change. Elabein harbayim yaktirena lomali, and there's a nusach in the back that tells me to take out lomali because it's not a kasha that it's extra. It's just a kasha. What do you do with the lashon yaktirena, which yaktirena is extra now, because now that oisoi, now that we're learning oisoi to tell me that the Neiros are after the Keteris, we had a mashmoyis from bein harbayim yaktirena that tells us that the Keteris is after the Neiros. Zok Gemara hachik omar. This is how you would touch This is what the Torah is teaching us. When you light the neiros, the ketores should already have been done. So at the time of the Dlakas neiros, the ketores had to have already been done. So it's not contradictory to what we're saying that the neiros should be done after the ketores. So again, we have two nuschos. If everybody agrees that you first bring the ketores and then you light the neiros, the question is, does this occur before the Korban Pesach, like the second nusach that we just had, or does this occur after the Korban Pesach, like the earlier nusach that we had? Zok the Gemara weiter. Tanu Rabbanan. Ein loch dover shekodim l'tamid shel shachar el ketores bilvad. The only thing that you could bring before the Talmud Shel Shachar is the ketores. And Rashi tells us it doesn't mean nothing at all. It means ein loch dover beishim, nothing that you burn on the mizbech, nothing that gets burnt in a fire. Nothing comes before the Talmud Shel Shachar besides the ketores. Shenemar ba boiker. It says ba boiker by the ketores, and therefore we do it first. The yuktam ketores dover shenemar ba boiker ketores, where it says ba boiker. The chsiv hikter olav aron ketores samim ba boiker, that should come before the dover shaloi nemer boy ella boiker echad. By the Talmud, it only says one time boiker. So again, if we look at the psukim, Victor olive iron ketores samim ba boiker, that's the lashon of the neiros, and it's a kev echad tasa ba boiker, it's a kev echad tasa ben boy. So we have a little bit of a problem because it's talking about ketores, and the pasuk that says ba boiker seems to be talking about the menorah. Am I making a mistake, or is that what it says? So I guess we're learning that ketores comes together. So let's see what it says. So let's see that. Let's see the Ketunder. But enoch tovah shekodim l'tomah shel shachar l'ketores bilvad shenemar b'boiker v'iktum ketores davar shenemar b'boiker d'chsiv Victor alavar and ketores ham b'boiker. No, it is by ketores. I'm making a mistake. So I'm not. Where is this pasuk? I read the wrong pasuk. Victor alavar and ketores ham b'boiker. So it is. It's just that when you're makriv the ketores, you also do the neiros at the same time. So I apologize. So b'boiker, it says beferish by ketores. It says it twice, which tells us it'll come before the Korban Tamid, where it only says one boiker. The ein loch dover shemis akiv acher tamid shel bein harabayim, and there's nothing that is done after the tamid shel bein harabayim ela ketores v'neiros, except for ketores v'neiros, because we discussed those items earlier, again because of the pasuk of Oisai. And now is where we learn new things. Pesach, we know that the Korban Pesach is also brought after the Tamid Shel Bein Arbayim, again because the pasuk says Ba'erev and Bein Arbayim by Pesach, and it only says Bein Arbayim once by Tamid. And here we have a new halacha u'mechusar kippurim be'erev Pesach. Now the halacha is, even after you're totally tahar, you have to bring. There are certain tumas where you have to bring a korban, such as a yeledes, a zov, a Metzorah. So imagine if the one of these people, they did their tefillah, they counted their days, and now the last thing that they have to do in order to be able to catch him is to bring their karbanos. And this is Erev Pesach. So imagine they joined the Chabura for Pesach, and they realized that they didn't bring their karbanos yet. So they've already brought the Talmud Shel Bein Harabayim. They've already brought the Korban Pesach, and they just realized that they can't be part of the Korban Pesach because they're still Mechusar Kippurim. So Zok the Braisa, they would be able to bring their karbanos even though it's after the Talmud Shel Bein Harabayim, if they got stuck in such a situation. So the halacha is that they bring their karbanos shetovel shenis, and Rashi says they tovel again. And Rashi, even though they already tovel before, because you have to tovel, you first at full yoim, then you're Mechusar Kippurim. There's still an Indian that after the korban is brought, they tovel again. That was just to show everybody that now they're in the clear. And then and then they can eat their korban Pesach. So we see an exception that a Mechusar Kippurim who won't be able to eat the korban Pesach tonight, unless they violate the rule that the Talmud should be the last thing, they're allowed to bring those extra karbanos. Rabbi Shmuel is more liberal. Rabbi Shmuel b'noi shel Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka omer af mechutz kippurim b'shar yemos hashana shetoivel v'oichel b'kachim le'erev. Even a mechutz kippurim not on there of Pesach, where it's extremely important that he eat the korban Pesach tonight. What if this fellow had donated a korban shlamim, which could only be eaten for 2 days and 1 night, and he's at the end of the second day, and he won't be able to eat from his shlamim? There's a mitzvah to eat kachim. There's a mitzvah to eat kachim, and he won't be able to eat from his shlamim unless he brings the karbanos. So any day during the week where he's in such a predicament, we allow him to bring the karbanos to finish off his zova or his tzaras, or if it's a woman who yoldis, in order they can eat the kachim from the shlamim that they would have brought earlier. So Zok Gemara, Bishlam Latanakama, I understand the urgency of eating the korban Pesach tonight. Why would we be doicha the Isser or the Isser Asay of not being makrib anything after the Talmud Shal Ben Arbayim? Yovei Asay the Pesach sheyesh boy kares, the Asay of Pesach, which is associated with an Isser kares if someone does not bring the korban Pesach, the Yitcha Asay the Hashlama. And let it be doicha the asay of hashlam kol karbanis kulam, the asay that tells us that one should not be makriv of any karbanis after the Talmud Shal Ben Arbayim is brought. Shein bekaris. Ella Rabbi Shmuel b'noi shel Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka, my umad ahayasay mehayasay. We have an asay that tells you should eat your korban shlamim, but we have an asay that says you're not allowed to be makriv any karbanis after the Talmud Shal Ben Arbayim. So why should you be doicha one asay for the other asay? So this comment requires a little bit of explanation, because first of all, we know that there's a rule. The only time you say asay doicha lois asay is when while you're doing the asay, or is when while you're being over the lois asay, you're actually in that very action being mekayim asay. But if you're being over the lois asay at a different time than you're doing the asay, so while you're doing the asay, you're not doicha the lois asay, it's at a separate time, then you don't say asay doicha lois asay. Here, I'm doing the things at a different time. I'm bringing the korban to take care of my mechusik kippurim in the day, and then the next night I'm going to be eating from the korban Pesach. So it's not at the same time. So Tosfos says that this halacha, that it has to be done at the same time, is only for an asay doicha lois asay. A lois asay is much more severe than an asay. But here we're talking about an asay being doicha asay. They don't have to happen at the same time. That's one of the terutzim of Tosfos. So the Gemara has a problem, and by Pesach night, I understand why you should violate the Isser Asay of being makriv karbanis after the close, after the Talmud Shal Ben Arbayim was brought, because you don't want to violate the Isser Asay, which has a chiyuv chorus of being mevatel eating the korban Pesach. But on a regular day, where there's a mitzvah say to eat from your korban shlamim, but there's also a mitzvah say that tells you not to bring these karbanis after the Talmud Shal Ben Arbayim, who said one should take precedence over the other? If anything, shaval tasod. Amar Avinu Amar Chista, hacha bechatos oifaskina. One of the karbanis that a Yeledus brings, if she's poor, or a Metzorah brings, is a chatos ha'oif. A chatos ha'oif, there's no part of the chatos ha'oif that you're makrib on the mizbeach. The meat is given to the kohen. So Zok Reb Chista, the korban that Rabbi Shmuel ben Noisho, Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka was talking about, that you're allowed to bring even after the Talmud Shal Ben Arbayim, the korban that we're talking about is a chatas ha'oif she'ein lemizbeach el adama. So since there is no haktara on the mizbeach, the iser is ishim al mizbeach. The iser is only to put a korban on the mizbeach, but the shecht, or in this case, to do malika, there's no problem. So in fact, it's not a seidoicha. It's not an seidoicha to say. There is no asay to be doicha because there is no iser to make malika on the chatas ha'oif, because you're not putting its meat on the mizbeach. Rav Papa Amar, afilu tema b'chatas behema. Even if it's a chatas behema, it's not a poor korban. it's the carbon of a gvir could bring a behema, where it will have to be brought on the mizbeach. It's still not a problem because maila umalina b'reish mizbeach. You're not going to put it on the fire on the mizbeach. You're not going to burn it. You'll put the meat up on the mizbeach, and then tomorrow you'll put it on the fire. You're worried about noiser. We know that once the meat of a carbon is placed on the mizbeach, it's not subject to noiser anymore. So you put it up on the mizbeach. You're not over being makter it after the Talmud Shel Ben Arbaim because you're not makter it. You just put it up there on the mizbeach, and then the next morning they'll put it on the fire. Frek the Gemara, wonderful. That explains what you would do with a carbon chatos. But for Ika Asham, as part of the group of karbonis that some of the Mechusar Kapurim have to bring, there's a carbon asham. So what are you going to do with the carbon asham? Bishimler Papa, Hainu, the Malala. There's no problem. According to Papa, the same thing you did with the chatos, you'll do with the asham. You'll bring the meat up on the mizbeach, and you won't be makrabit. Elul Reb Chisda, who he only had a solution for an oif, that works great for the chatos. But by the asham, it has to be a behema. So what are you going to do? What are you going to do with the problem that you're not allowed to be makriv, this asham, after the Talmud Shel Ben Arbaim? Michael Neymar, Amri Zok Gemara Shakar Vashamai. Say that the case here is when you were already makriv the carbon asham, and the only thing remaining is the chatos oif. So now you don't have a problem. So again, we're limiting the scope of Rabbi Shmuel ben Noshel, Rabbi Yechim ben Broika's comment when he said that you could be makriv for a Mechusar Kapurim. He meant if it was a Mechusar Kapurim and he happened to have already brought his asham, and the only thing outstanding is the chatos, which is planning to bring us an oif, then you can be makriv it because it won't violate the problem of being makriv meat on the mizbeach after the carbon Talmud Shel Ben Arbaim. Fact the Gemara, okay, but the problem is you have a carbon oila as well that has to be a behema. If you're going to say that the oila is not ma'akiv, meaning he won't bring the oil, he'll wait for tomorrow to bring the oila. For Tanya Rabbi Shmuel ben Noshel Rabbi ben Baraka, the same Tana who we're discussing, he says, just like if he doesn't bring his chatas and nosham yet, he may not eat from kachim. If he didn't bring his carbon oil, he can't either eat from the kachim. And if you want to use the same svar that we use for asham, and say we're discussing someone who already brought his oila and he already brought his asham, he just didn't bring his chatas, and the chatas will be a chatas oif. Dr. Gemara, that couldn't have happened. Is it possible to argue that he brought the oila before the chatas? It doesn't work. You cannot bring the oila before the chatas. This word rishon is removed. Tanya, we learned the hikriv es asher lechatas rishon. The pasuk says, and this is speaking, I believe, by Shavuos Ha'edos, you should bring the chatas first, and then the pasuk says, Matam ad loimer. What is the Torah trying to teach us when it says you should bring the chatos first? Im lalamid should take kodemis la'oila. If it's just trying to teach us to order the karbonis, harei kvar nemar, it already says regarding this carbon, ves hasheni yasa oila kamishpat. So by this parasha alone of Shavuos, we already know that first you bring the chatos, then you bring the oila. Why did the Torah in that parsha offer a redundancy and tell us a second time that the chatos comes before the oila? Elazeh bona av. This is to broadcast this halacha to any time when you need to bring a chatos and an oila. L'chol chatois sheyu koidmois l'chol oilos habois siman. Anytime a pair, a chatos and an oila has to be brought, the chatos must be brought first. So kum techois, in this case, if there's a chatos or oif outstanding, for sure you didn't bring the oil yet. So we still have a problem. How are you going to bring the oil? The kaimalam, the afilu chatos ha'oif koidemis l'olis habehema. If you're going to bring a chatos oif together with a behema for the oila, you might think, oh, since it's a behema, it should take precedence. No, you always bring the chatos first, and only afterwards do you bring the oila. So the problem is clearly, if you didn't bring the oila yet, because you're bringing the chatos now, you're still in the Mechusar Kapurim. So how could this Mechusar Kapurim eat from the carbon? Amarava, shiny oilas Metzorah, the oil of Metzorah, which is who we're talking about as the Mechusar Kapurim, does not follow the rules of Kolatar Kula, even though you have a binyan av to teach you that Becholatar Kula, the chatos comes before the oilas Metzorah is an exception to that rule. The Rachmana Omar, the Torah tells us by Oilus Metzorah, the Hela Hakoyin Es HaOlah. The Hela is a lotion of Ovar. He already has brought the Olah when he brought the Chatos. Shehela Kfar. And Tosfos tells us that this is only B'di'evet, meaning L'chatchila Avada, you have to bring first the carbon Chatos and then the carbon Olah. But B'di'evet, if you brought the Olah first, that would be good. So Zok the Gemara, according to this pshat, we'll learn that he brought his Osham already. He brought his Olah already, even though he wasn't supposed to. All that's remaining is the Chatos Ha'oif. The Chatos Ha'oif he's allowed to bring even after the Talmud shall bein Harabayim. And the reason why he can bring it even after the Talmud shall bein Harabayim is because we're not being makrav and himid on the Mizbeach. Amal Rab Shimon bar Abba Rab Papa. L'didach, according to you, the Amit Maila Umalina B'Rosh Shal Mizbeach. So what was your solution? Not a problem. You could be makrav any of the karbanis. You could shecht and process any of the karbanis after the Talmud Shal Bein Arbaim. Just avoid being makrav it. So what do? You take all the meat, you put it on top of the mizbeach, and you don't throw it onto the mizbeach until the next day. The problem is, are you suggesting kaimin v'avdinin milsa l'kayhanim the asubah l'dei takalo? By having this meat sitting there on top of the mizbeach, the kohanim are there all night, and they're being makter the emurim that they didn't have a chance to be makter yet throughout the day. The kohanim would be makter the emurim all night. If there's a pile of meat there, how are they going to know that this meat is not supposed to be put on the fire? The savri, they're going to think the yoimehu that this meat is like any other meat on the mizbeach, that we have to burn it tonight. But also lakture. So you're creating a very dangerous scenario by putting meat on the mizbeach that's not supposed to be put on the fire. Amrilei, he told him, that's not a problem. Kaihanim is reasoning. Kaihanim, you tell them this meat is not supposed to be burnt, they don't make careless mistakes. If you tell them that this should not be burnt, you can be 100% confident that it won't be burnt. Amalei Rav Ashi Rav Kahana, Amalei Rav Huna Bered, Rav Nosson Rav Papa. In fact, Gemara Rav Kama Deloy Miskatri, Amurin, Kaihanim lemotzach lebasar. The halacha is the Kaihanim are not allowed to eat the basar of the carbon until the emurin were brought, which means this chatos, this asham that we're talking about, the Kaihanim will not be able to eat the meat. Why won't they be able to eat the meat? Because we're not being makriv the meat till tomorrow. The Tanya, Yachol you Kaihanim Rishoyin b'chazav v'shoik koydem aktar shemurin by a shlomim where the Kaihanim get the chazav v'shoik. You might think that they're allowed to already take and eat the chazav v'shoik even before they were makter the murin of the carbon shlomim. Tamadami viktra koydem zachelav hamizbecha the hadar, and only after that occurs the haya hachazal aron lebanov. Now, so we know the Kohanim will not be able to eat the meat of this asham, of this chatos tonight, because they have to wait till tomorrow until you're makter. The chama, the Kohanim, achli basar, we also know that by a carbon chatos, if the Kohanim did not yet eat the meat, bailam loy miskapri, the bailam don't get their kapara. The Tanya we learned, va'achlu oisam asher kupar bahem. By a chatos it says the Kohanim should eat it through which the kapara will occur. So the problem is, if the Kohanim can't eat the meat of the chatos, what good does it do me that they were makriv the chatos? Yesterday, I still can't eat from kachim because until the Kohanim actually eat the meat, which they can't eat because you weren't makriv yet, you weren't makriv the emurim yet, I don't have a kapara. So we're right back where we started from. Amar lei, Kivan Deloy Efsher, since we're in an impossible situation, because it's impossible for them to be makter it now, because we have the problem of the carbon Talmud Shabbat Arbaim was done already. So they're stuck. So in such a case, Asum Kamisha Nitmu Oisha. We treat it as if the meat became, as if the emurin became Tameh, or the emurin were lost. And Rashi says, in the case where the emurin became Tameh, or they were lost, and therefore you could no longer be makter them on the mizbeach. Umishteri kahanim b'achilas basar. Therefore, the kahanim are allowed to eat the meat, even though we were not yet makter the emurim. Have a kapara l'baylim, and there'll be a kapara. The Tanya we learned.
I was just going to ask, where do we know this from?
Oh, so the
Okay.
Gemara is going to explain now. The Tanya Yochel litmu emur no shavdu lo yehu kaihanim zakoyin b'chazav v'shoy by a shlomim. You might have thought that if the emurim became tamei or they got lost, and therefore you couldn't be marked to them, it automatically disqualifies the chazav v'shoy as well from being distributed to the kaihanim. They get it anyway. As long as there's a srika stam, they get it anyway. So therefore here, since we have a situation that's out of our hands and we can't be makter the meat, because we can't be makter tonight, we'll still allow the kohanim to eat the meat today of the chatos, which will provide the kapara that the mechusar kapara needs, and therefore the mechusar kaparim will be able to eat tonight from the shlomim that he had, or in the case of a carbon pesach, he'd be able to do that as well. Rav Kahana asked a stira. Ksiv loyolin chelev chagi ad boiker. And I believe this is speaking about the Korban Pesach. It says, Leisisbech al chamit dam zivchi, v'loyolin chelev chagi ad boiker. You're not allowed to let the Pesach stay overnight. Ad boiker, hu de loyolin. It's not allowed to be left till the next morning. Hakala laila kula yolin. You're allowed to allow the meat, the emurin, to remain all night. Uchsiv, the problem is, it says v'hikter aleh chel v'yashlomim. It says that they're not allowed to be makriv anything after the tamid shel bein harbayim. Aleh hashlim kol carbon kula. So we have a stira. How could you say that you could be makter the emurim of the Pesach all night? It should say that you cannot be makter them all night, because after you're makter the tamid, you can no longer be makter the Pesach. So Dr. Gemara, who moisivla?
And this, I was wondering about this myself, but you're not doing any action. You're just letting it sizzle on the mizbeach through the night. That's what I figured.
Well, you're going to be putting it on the mizbeach.
But it was already put on the mizbeach, wasn't it?
Lavdavka. It seems to say that even if you seems to say as long as you get it on before the morning, you're going to be okay.
Yeah, okay, let's see how the Gemara treats it. Okay.
So Rashi, as long as the dam of the karbonis, so we're talking about the chagigos, even as long as their dam was spritzed on the mizbeach before the tamid, but we just didn't put the meat yet on the mizbeach, that's not going to be a problem. The kivan de near lahakrava koidim lachein, since these karbonis were already spritzed, so they were already royal to be put on the mizbeach. It's just that they were busy; they didn't have time to put it on the mizbeach yet, but they were royal to be put on the mizbeach. Lachein al tamid shel shachar humuslam. It's considered that this was after the tamid shel shachris, before the tamid shel bein harbayim. So now we learned a new halacha about loyol chelev chagi. Once it's not pshat. It's not pshat that the last thing you have to put on the mizbeach has to be the tamid shel bein harbayim. Rather, the last thing that it has to be royu to be put on the mizbeach has to be the tamid shel bein harbayim. So if this rikas dam was done from another carbon before the tamid shel bein harbayim, but then when we were processing all the meat, we happen to have put the meat of the tamid on the mizbeach first, you're still allowed to put the meat of the other karbonis, because all that meat was already prepared to be put on the mizbeach before we put the meat of the tamid shel bein harbayim on the mizbeach. Ramalei Rav Shafar L'Rav Ksiv Lo Yolin LaBoiker Zevach Chag HaPasach. So this is talking about the Korban Pesach itself. LaBoiker Hu Lo Yolin Hakol Alai Lo Yolin. V'Ksiv Olah Shabbos B'Shabbat. We have another problem here, because the problem is Erev Pesach is normally a weekday, and Pesach itself, Pesach by night, is a Yom Tov. So the problem is V'Ksiv Olah Shabbos B'Shabbat V'Lo Olah Schoil B'Shabbos. You're not allowed to be makriv a murin of a carbon that was shechted b'choil, so it's a carbon that's designated to the day of choil. You're not allowed to be makriv those a murin on Shabbos. So you have a carbon Pesach that was shechted on Erev Pesach in the day of choil. How could you be makriv there a murin on the mizbeach on Yom Tov? V'lo yalas choil b'Yom Tov. Amar lei kfar ramyu neheli Rab Aber bar Chia l'Rabavo. This question is a beautiful question, but somebody else already asked this question. Vishanile, and he answered. Here, this pasuk this specific pasuk that says, Lo yolon laboy kezel chag Pesach, this is speaking about a case where Erev Pesach was Shabbos, and you shechted the korban Pesach on Shabbos. So it's not an oil of choil that you're being makter on Yom Tov. It's an oil of Shabbos, or it's a korban of Shabbos that you're being makter on Yom Tov. The chalvei Shabbos craving Yom Tov. Amar lei. So he said, I don't like this teretz. So who asked this kasha? Reb Safra said, I don't like this teretz. Mishum the chalvei Shabbos craving Yom Tov. Just because the only example you were able to think of to make this allowable by saying that Erev Pesach was Shabbos that year, where the pasuk is talking about Anan Negu v'nei Malay the high kra ba'arba aser shecholios b'Shabbos u'dichsiv. You're making a big doichet. The pasuk just said it plain because your only solution was this, because you couldn't think of a better teretz. Because of that, you're forcing the pasuk to be speaking only in a case where Erev Pesach was a Shabbos. Amar lei. So he answered back. So Rav answered back. This is not me. Shafkei lekra dehudochik umukamanavshe. The pasuk got itself into trouble. The pasuk said this. I didn't say this. So unfortunately, the only way to properly explain the pasuk, to say that it would be allowed to be makar ve'murim on Yom Tov that are really from a korban of choil is only if it happened to have been Shabbos, the day that those emurim came up.
I didn't understand the question. This happens all over Shas, that they have to fit in a situation that'll make sense with the pasuk.
And all over Shas, you don't like it.
What? No, I don't like it, but what can you do?
Right, so you see Reb Safra didn't either like it, so you're in very,
Okay,
very...
but I just hear he didn't like it. What about all over Shas?
I hear. But at least you have an ally over here.
Yeah, okay. I'll take what I could get. All right.
Okay, let's see the Gemara weiter. HaPesach sheshachtu shaloi l'shmoi. A Pesach that you shechted shaloi l'shmoi. So Rashi says, what does shaloi l'shmoi means? You had in mind that it was a shloma. V'kibo v'holach v'zorach shaloi l'shmoi. So there are four primary avodas that your kavanah will pass. And that's shchita, kabbalah, halacha, drika. So if any of these avodas were done shaloi l'shmoi, or it was done l'shmoi v'shaloi l'shmoi, meaning you started off with a kavanah of l'shma and you ended off with a kavanah of shaloi l'shma. And the Gemara is going to probe what this means. Does this mean in the shchita you started off with l'shma and in the middle of the shchita you switched to shaloi l'shma, or does it mean for the whole shchita you were l'shma, but for the kabbalah you were shaloi l'shma? So this dual kavanah, is it in the same avodah or is it in two different avodas? And the Gemara is going to probe this right after the Mishnah. Or you first started with shaloi l'shma and then you finished off with l'shma. Pasul, that korban will be pasul. Ketzad l'shmoi v'shaloi l'shmoi. What would be an example of a kavanah that would be l'shmoi v'shaloi l'shmoi? So the Mishnah l'shem Pesach or l'shem shlema. You first, when you were shechting it, let's say that's pshat that it's in the shechita itself. You first had a kavanah l'shem Pesach, in the middle you switched kavanah l'shem shlema. Shaloi l'shmoi v'l'shmoi would be l'shem shlamim. First you have in mind it was for shlamim, and then l'shem Pesach in the middle you switched l'shem Pesach. And I guess we could stop over here. Shkoyach.
Yasha koyach.
Yeah, sure.
Correct.